years ago, I think, because my legs are struggling today, and I was a little shaky in the legs, so I'm not wanting to move around too much today. But anyways, that was my Saturday. I hope you guys, like I said, had a good weekend. But we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 12. And before we get into chapter 12, I just kind of want to recap again what happened towards the end of chapter 11. There was of course, we went through and we kind of looked at Solomon and all the various things that he had done wrong. And I guess if you're going to kind of summarize it, is that he became really obsessed with riches and just lost his focus on God. His focus was divided between God and all this other stuff, until he ultimately ends up being way too dedicated to his wives over God even. And he ends up doing things for their gods rather than being totally focused on the one true God. And so that ends up turning his heart away from God, but God intervenes and he talks. He again appears to Solomon. This is the third time that he appeared to him as we read through the book of 1 Kings. And the first two times that God visited Solomon, it was good, right? It was good things that he was saying to him. The first time he blesses him with all that wisdom. He says he's going to give him honor and riches like nobody before or anyone after. The second time is during the middle of when he's building that temple, and God essentially just blesses what he is doing and commends him for what he's doing and approves of it. But now this time, again, Solomon, his heart turning away from God, he's obsessed with riches, collecting tons of gold, and really just going against several direct commandments that are given, and as we looked in Deuteronomy, namely, again, marrying foreign wives and serving their foreign gods. But God visits him during this time, and I think really it ends up being an act of grace, even though the things that God is saying to Solomon aren't going to be things that he wants to hear. It's God's grace that he tells him those things at all, giving him a chance to repent. And perhaps it's this conversation that God has with Solomon that ultimately leads him to pen the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't know, that's a book, and people talk about when that might have been written. We don't know for certain, but we look at Solomon, we see he's old and he turns his heart away from God, but then he pens Ecclesiastes seemingly at the end of his life, teaching us to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And so perhaps that is a result of God confronting him for his actions and getting him to see just how far he has fallen. But because Solomon turns his heart away from God, because he's serving these false gods and has lost focus and has put God on the back burner, so to speak, there's this man named Jeroboam. And what's significant about Jeroboam? First of all, we know that Solomon has all these adversaries that are raised against him. He's got an adversary to the north, to the south. But then there's this man Jeroboam who's going to be an adversary to Solomon. And where is he from?
He wanted to be king.
Well, he's going to end up being king. I don't know that he necessarily wanted to at the time, if he was even thinking that far ahead. But we know that he's from the tribe of Ephraim, I believe is what it is. He's from Israel. And this man Jeroboam, he impresses Solomon even. And Solomon, he puts him over what? What does he do? He notices this man Jeroboam, he's impressed by him, and so he gives him a job. And what job was that?
To represent.
He puts him over forced labor. That's what he does. He puts him over forced labor. But then there's this man, Ahijah, sorry, I'm trying to get these prophet names straight in my head, but Ahijah. And he comes and he prophesies to Jeroboam. And what is that prophecy that he gives to Jeroboam? Yeah, he's going to be king. And more importantly, what else is going to happen? Remember, Ahijah is kind of this weird thing. He's wearing this brand new garment. It says he's got this new garment on, and he comes upon Jeroboam, and he walks up, he talks to Jeroboam, but he takes that garment, and what does he do with that garment? Yeah, he rips it up into 12 pieces, and how many pieces does he give to Jeroboam?
2.
He gives him 10, right? And then the 2 are going to remain with, who are going to be Judah and the tribe of Benjamin as well. But what is that meant to represent as he gives those 10 pieces of clothing?
Northern Kingdom.
Yeah, Northern Kingdom, that's right. So by doing this, Ahijah prophesies, and as was already told to Solomon, the kingdom is going to be ripped out of Solomon's hand. It's going to be given to his servant. That's what he's told. That man ends up being Jeroboam. And he's going to get 10 tribes, and there's going to be 2 tribes remaining to the house of David. That's the house of Judah itself, and then Benjamin, of course. And so what you have there in short is a prophecy concerning a divided kingdom. Do you see how quickly things went south as Solomon turns his heart away from God? At one point, it's the greatest nation on earth, people flowing from all ends of the earth to come and hear the wisdom of Solomon. And who knows what they're taking back to the countries they came from as they're coming and learning about God. But all of a sudden, he starts serving these false gods, and now the kingdom's already being divided and being prophesied in his lifetime. Yes, Linda.
I think it's significant that he was put in charge of the labor of the tribe of Joseph, because that's the start of his power with the northern tribes.
Yep. Yeah, because that ends up being a big deal when he gathers. It says all Israel and Jeroboam gathered before Rehoboam, and we'll talk about that. Is interesting. Did I see another hand? Was it Wayne or somebody? No. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's going to be a big deal as we pick up in chapter 12. And so that's kind of what we're left with, is this prophecy telling, again, Jeroboam that he's going to be given this kingdom. But he prophesies as well that he's going to leave a lamp in Judah, as he calls it, to David. He says, but to his son, and this is talking about Solomon, to his son I will give 1 tribe, and that's going to be Benjamin. That my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen for myself to put my name. One thing that's interesting about this to me is David's impact on Israel even after he's dead. It's been a whole generation since he's been gone. And yet they're still being preserved really because of what God, he calls him, my servant David. And I think that that's something that we ought to consider as we're making decisions, and we're often faced with decisions, but we're trying to serve God on a daily basis. How is my walk and how is my faith going to impact the people after me? Now, none of us here are kings. We're probably not going to influence an entire nation the way that King David did. But who are the people that we have the power of influence over, and how we walk, and the example that we're giving? Who is it that we have influence over? Yeah. How about family? As Esther said, family. What is it that Paul says that he's going to glorify God, whether by life or by death? That's interesting to me, because I think anybody can start glorifying God in life, like starting right now, just by obeying the gospel. But to glorify God in death, that's not something that you can just do right now. To glorify God in death, you really have to dedicate your entire life to serving Him. And then it's like this legacy that you leave once you pass on to the next life. I mean, how many people do you know in your life who have served God faithfully, and they pass away, and it just leaves an impression on you? And it causes you to think differently. And when that person passes, you're thinking soberly, and you're thinking, wow, what a great example of faith. How can I be more like that? What can I learn from this person to draw closer to God? I think that's really what you have with David and the influence that he left. That when he died, he immediately left this legacy. That he wasn't perfect, but he served God his entire life. And I think that's something that we need to learn from and consider, that our actions, our faith, can seriously impact the people after us. We may not see it in this life right now, but when we dedicate our lives to serving God, we don't know the impact, how great an impact that can have on our family, on our friends, and whoever it is that looks up to us. We really don't know the people who look up to us. And that legacy and how you glorify God is really solidified when you die like that. And I think that's what you have with David. He glorified God in his death. Even in life or in death, he glorified God. And so that's just, again, something to consider. But you look at this, and again, this conversation, he says, I'm going to leave a lamp to Judah, which is interesting, because you think about a lamp and what that represents. Perhaps it represents a lineage, a continued lineage, but we think about a lamp and Jesus being a light. And I can't help but make that connection as he says that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. I mean, we look at Jesus and he ends up being the light of the world, doesn't he? And what greater lamp is there really than Jesus? And so I can't help but think about that and make that connection. But he goes on, and what kind of floors me is he makes a covenant through, obviously, Ahijah is talking. He's talking on behalf of God. And God makes this covenant with Jeroboam. He says, then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. What's impressive to you about this? Really, it's a covenant that's being made. Is there anything that stands out to you?
It's like he did with Solomon.
Yeah.
If you follow what I tell you to do, then I will give back to you the honors and the...
Yeah. Well, and I think what particularly impresses me about it is that it's not that he's just making, a covenant. It's not that he's just saying, you'll be great and I'll bless you. But he compares it and he says, I'll build for you an enduring house as I built for David. And at this point, the kingdom that started with David, really, and that dynasty that started with David, is there any better kingdom in the world than that? But God tells Jeroboam, I'll make one that's comparable. I'm making a covenant with you, and I'll bless you in the same way that I blessed David. Well, that's incredible. And so you have this divided kingdom, and really what it is that it's not good that God's people divide, even though this is the will of God. But it's an opportunity to have two thriving nations dedicated towards God. And you can imagine the influence that they could have that way, but we know it doesn't end up going that way, do we? As the kingdom to the north, they don't have a single righteous king in all their history. I think 19 kings is what they end up having, not a single one of them is righteous. And so what you end up having, I love the picture here. I just pulled this off the internet. Those two guys, kind of weird pictures, but that's all right. But you have these two kingdoms, and so now we got Rehoboam, which could that be any more confusing that we're talking about two different kings right now? One's Jeroboam and one's Rehoboam. So forgive me if I get them mixed up when I'm talking. But Rehoboam is whose son? That's Solomon's son. So we read about that, and towards the end of towards the end of chapter 11 and at the beginning of chapter 12, we read that in verse 41, the rest of the acts of Solomon, whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Thus, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. Then Rehoboam went in Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And meanwhile, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it. He was living in Egypt, for he was in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. And so here you have Solomon, he dies, which again, that should be sobering to us, because Solomon had everything, but all good things come to an end. Everything he had, he wasn't able to take with him. We understand that. We even see that in David. But notwithstanding, you have this divided kingdom, and now he's leaving it to somebody else, Rehoboam. Rehoboam takes place, and it's from here onward that we're going to really see the divided kingdom and the division of the kingdom unfolding. And so again, we remember Jeroboam. In Jeroboam, he fled, and why did he flee to Egypt? We read about that in verse 40. Why did Jeroboam, who Ahijah had talked about, again, let's not get their names confused. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Jeroboam is from the tribe of Ephraim, right?
Solomon fled to kill him.
Yeah. Solomon was going to kill him, and that's reminiscent of what when we talk about this?
David.
King Saul, right? And isn't it interesting how Solomon, he's the wisest king who's ever ruled the earth, but he takes this guy from inside and he appoints him and gives him this power over forced labor. And he's going to be the one that ends up receiving that kingdom. And it's almost like you see Solomon losing some of that wisdom that he had, where he was so good at putting people in charge, so good at governing, and then towards the end of his life, he makes this huge mistake. But again, it's the will of God that it happens, and it ends up leading to the divided kingdom. Yeah, Wayne?
Just a different slant
Yeah.
on that. Instead of saying forced labor, you might say public works.
Yeah.
Here's,
Public works.
he was in charge of building all of the infrastructure that Solomon had asked for.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. But the reason I say forced labor is because, we end up learning in chapter 12 that the people really felt strongly that Solomon was working them way too hard. And so that's important to note as well. It's going to be a huge factor. So he flees to Egypt, and then Solomon dies, and he hears about it. Jeroboam hears that Solomon dies, and that Rehoboam, his son, is king in his place. And so now Jeroboam, what does he do? He comes back, doesn't he? He comes back. Rehoboam becomes king in place of Solomon, but then Jeroboam and the rest of Israel assemble, and they assemble before Rehoboam. And what is it that they request? Let's pick up in verse 3, and we'll read through 5. It says, then they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. Then he said to them, depart for 3 days, that I have concerning this. As you have Jeroboam, and he fled to Egypt. But he comes back, and it's like he's the ringleader. It says all of Israel, which I assume to be somewhat of a general statement. But it says all of Israel and Jeroboam assembles. And it appears that he's like the spokesperson for many of the people of Israel before the king. It's like he has this huge following. And so Jeroboam, he was away in Egypt, and it seems that he comes back and he already has this big following. And I just asked the question, how is that even possible? Yeah, Wayne.
Well, again, let me add to that, that while he was in Egypt, his stature somehow made him friends with the Pharaoh, who later comes and helps.
Yeah.
So he's no lightweight. He knows what he's doing politically and logistically.
Yeah, well, what caused him, because he came back and he has favor with Israel. What caused him to have favor with the people of Israel? What's that? Well, I think the main thing that it is, and I'll just say this, again, what was his job that Solomon put him in charge of? Forced labor. He was in charge of forced labor. And so you can imagine that he builds up a rapport with these people that are being forced into labor, and he builds a relationship with them. And then he comes back to them and says, look, you guys shouldn't be working this hard. You're being oppressed. Let's go take this to the king. And so he tells them what they want to hear, and it appears that he probably takes advantage of that position of power that he was in before to give the people hope and get some of them to follow him, get a majority of them to follow him. I think he takes advantage of that position of power for sure. Linda.
Well, he's described in chapter 11 as the man Jeroboam was very able, and
Yeah.
Solomon saw that the young man was industrious. He gave him charge. So he has some traits in his personality that would lend him to be leadership
Yeah.
and be able to lead people. And he's really requesting the king to do something for the people. He's trying to save the nation, actually, because we find that that's the division of the nation, is that Rehoboam is not willing to give relief to the people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And if we're talking about that, I think one of the reasons Jeroboam, as you said, he obviously had some charm about him. He had the traits necessary to be a political leader. God chose him. I mean, the divided kingdom, that ends up being something that God prophesies. It ends up being according to God's will. Not originally what God wanted, but as a consequence of Israel's sin, this is what's happening. And he chooses Jeroboam to be king. So God saw something in Jeroboam that said he's capable of leading a lot of people. With that being said, you can imagine how many followers you could get by saying, hey, you guys work too hard, you should work a little less, right? That's going to get a lot of followers. And so I think you have a combination of him having those traits and also being in the prime position, being in charge of forced labor, he had all that time to build a rapport. Now he's taking advantage of that, and he's using that charm and telling them what they want to hear, and he gets this big following, as we said, and it goes according to God's plan. Any comments? Or, yeah, JC.
Is there any significance to the fact that his name is sometimes translated as he pleads the people's case?
Well, yeah, I don't think that there's any coincidences when you talk about inspiration of Scripture, but I actually didn't realize that. That's interesting. So yeah, in this case, he's certainly pleading the people.
Literally, I'm on your side.
Yep, yeah, he's pleading the people's case, and he's certainly trying to be a people's king, isn't he? As opposed to what Rehoboam ends up being in these following verses. Yeah, Linda.
I don't know, it's just some reading I did, but I think it's a little bit more than, you guys won't have to work so hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Think about, you're in your home, we're in Salem, and somebody in Portland says, you've got to go to Portland and work, and you can't take care of your home or your family. We're gonna send you to Portland to build this kingdom.
Yeah.
And, that is a hardship. They
course.
did have a hardship.
No, there's no doubt about it. And I was kind of, that was in jest a little bit earlier. But yeah, I totally 100% agree. These people, they were being taken away. We saw that they would be gone, a month at a time, then they come back for 2 months. But when we talk about forced labor, you can imagine what that meant in the context of that era. We have an idea of what a hard day's work is. But we're looking back then at all the building that they were doing, and they don't have heavy machinery. And you can imagine how oppressed these people were becoming. Yeah, Brett.
A couple things. One is to remember the people have forgotten what God warned them about having a king in the first place.
Yeah.
But the king's going to do all this.
Yeah.
And they're acting as if, well, why are you doing this? Well, God warned them that the king, whoever it was would do these kinds of things. And then secondly, ruling at the children of Israel as the United Kingdom was very tricky because they were still very tribal.
Yeah.
They still had very close ties to Benjamite or Ephraimite or whatever. And it's less a United Kingdom than someone who's able to sort of make this coalition work, and they're still very much separate, sort of like a very tiny bit like the United States before the Civil War.
Yeah, you would certainly think that you would have some certain cultural differences as you're looking at different tribes and things like that, different families. About it wouldn't be an easy job, and that certainly appears to be the case. But who is it that they have on their side that makes it easier? It's God. If they remain faithful to Him, God's going to make it all work out. But they had a problem with that, as Solomon introduces idolatry into the land. And so you have this petition that's being made to Rehoboam. He needs to lighten their load, or else the people are going to rebel. He says, and they say, if you lighten our load, if you lighten our yoke, we'll serve you. Well, that's fair enough, isn't it? It seems like a fair request, and they're not. It doesn't appear that they're about to make war, although we know that they end up just basically packing their bags and leaving. But that seems like to be a fair request, and so this is what Rehoboam says. He says, let me think about it. Give me 3 days, depart from me, come back to me in 3 days. And so let's kind of read this exchange. I think it's 6 through 4. We'll read 6 through 14, but we'll probably break it up a little bit. It says, King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you counsel me to answer this people? Then they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to this people today, and will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. Well, it's interesting in a couple different respects. One, it's the elders who were serving even during the days of Solomon. And they seem to be willfully acknowledging the fact that, yeah, your father worked these people too hard. And they say, grant these people their petition. But what's really interesting to me, and I'll kind of get ahead here, is the advice that they give, because it reminds me of Jesus. Verse 7, it says, again, if you will be a servant to this people today, and will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. And the box I have up there just says, it's easy to serve a servant, isn't it? Well, what do I mean by that? Have you ever had a boss who asks you to do things that he himself would never do? Or do you ever have a boss who asks you to do something and you're in the middle of doing all these different things and he asks you to do something that he could do way more easily? He has more time to do it, but he just sits back in his chair. He never goes out of his way for you. How easy is it to work for a boss like that? How much do we enjoy that? Not a lot, right? Is that kind of what you have going on with the kingdom that Rehoboam's taking over? It's give me, give me, give me. Tax, tax, tax. But of course, this is what Samuel prophesied in 1 Samuel 8, that the king's going to take. We read that word multiple times when he's warning them about the future king of Israel, that he's going to take all these different things. But what about a boss who does go out of his way for you? Who he asks you to do something that you've seen him do 10 times before. Or when he asks you to do something, he says, you know what, no, you're busy, I'll do it. How easy is it to work for somebody like that? It's easy, isn't it? It makes you not just want to do what they ask, but to go out of your way for them, doesn't it? It's easy to serve a servant. Is there any better servants than Christ? Has there ever been a better servant than Christ? I have the cross reference up there, Mark 10, 43 through 45, but that's just talking about Jesus saying that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve. Jesus served us more and served us better in a way that we can never even come close to matching it. And so that should make it easy for us to serve him. And that's the principle that you're finding, the advice that you're given to Rehoboam, that, hey, if you serve these people, they're going to go out of their way for you. They're going to be loyal. And we see that that's what Christ did for us. He's even willing to die on the cross. And are those who recognize that sacrifice and those who recognize how he served us, are we willing to serve him forever? That's the expectation, isn't it? To serve him forever. Yeah, Dave.
The difference between a good leader and a bad leader is simple, and Jesus showed it so much in his life. He led by example.
Yeah.
And when you lead by example, you're willing to show the way and how it is to be done. Anybody can have someone who's in charge says, I just want you to do this, but really doesn't know how to get it done, but just gives orders. It's hard to follow that. But if you lead by example and show me how you want it done, I can follow that.
Yeah.
I can follow that very easily.
And so, yeah, exactly. And so what does this teach us about ourselves today and how we ought to be? Because I believe that every Christian, as they go out into the world, while our roles within the congregation vary, some of us are behind the scenes, we don't, things we do don't get noticed as much. But as we go out into the world, what are we really supposed to be? Leaders or followers? We're supposed to be leaders, right? And if we are just constantly judging people and expecting them to do things and then we're being a hypocrite, how likely is that to bring somebody to glorify God themselves? Is that shining the light that Christ has given us? No, we're to emulate that attitude of service that God had, that Jesus had. And the hope is that they'll come and glorify the same God that we're trying to glorify as well. And so we need to emulate that. So really what we get here is a lesson on leadership. It's easy to serve a servant, isn't it? And so we continue reading. Any other comments or questions, Miss Brad? Oh, sorry, Jeff.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
I love boys like this is adapting to the time without changing the word.
Yeah.
So you can think about, they had the same job, they had the same duty more or less, but the things had changed, and so their style was different. So they looked at the people that they were leading, and they had to change the ways to adapt. So they built the foundation, the relationships. No one likes to be ruled by an iron fist. No one likes to be dictated or micromanaged.
Mm-hmm.
But when Jeroboam came in and was able to do that, he was able to build a relationship. So the same principle with all parts of relationships, I think, in life, where whether it's you and I, or I want to encourage you, I got to have a relationship. If I'm trying to teach someone, I'm trying to build a relationship with them first. Then you're able to kind of do that more challenging conversation, hopefully. But I think it's also important to know that either one of these men were in a position to get something done, but they had to step back and adapt to what was being done at that time based on the need of the people. So it's the same thing in the church. The way the church and different leaders and people worked in the 40s and 50s and 60s is different today. People's education is different. The way people lead, the way people think today is really, really different. But God's word hasn't changed. so how you know your people, I think it also starts a lot, of course, within that relationship.
Yeah.
Besides, or regardless of what parallel we're talking about, it's the same principle in any relationship.
Right, and so I love kind of the underlying thing that you're saying there, that we can't come in and start making demands before we build a relationship with somebody, can we? I mean, that's absolutely key. That if you are just judging somebody, or if we're holding people accountable all the time, or pointing out their faults, is there a time for that? Is there a time to be bold and to have an honest conversation and say, hey, you're not doing what you need to be doing? Yes, there's a time for that, but what happens if that's all we're doing? And we never actually show that we care about that individual. Well, then they're not going to respond very kindly to that.
I remember a leader back during the days I was in the state, but this leader did something different I've never seen in any manager ever. And what the manager did is he went around and met with every individual employee and wanted to know how they worked, what they did, and got to know everyone in the work environment. And after doing that, was really concerned and what are your talents and what are your abilities? And asked this of every employee. And what happened as a result of that, when he got all that information, it took a couple of months, then he started doing things at that point, and boy, he was so successful. So successful. Because it could relate to him. He actually cares about what I do here. He cares about the work that I'm actually doing. Really? He came to me and talked to me. How's the family? How's it? Wow. When you can build that relationship, you can get a lot of things done.
Yeah, and relationships are give and take, which is, kind of the advice that's given here to him. But we pick up in verse 8, and of course, what does he do with that advice? It says, he forsook the counsel of the elders, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. And so basically he says, I'm not going to listen to these old guys, I'm going to listen to my friends. So he said to them, what counsel do you give that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? The young men who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, now you make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. And Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. So you have Rehoboam, he reaches this decision with his friends, basically saying, no, don't lighten the load, make it even heavier. Prove that you're better than your father. Prove that you're more powerful than Solomon was. And so Jeroboam comes back with the congregation of Israel and speaking on behalf of them again. And this is as they're directed. But the king answered the people harshly in verse 13, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I'll discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord, that he might establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And so, we look at this whole exchange that goes on here, and it can be very easy to, I don't want to say get lost, but there's a lot going on here. And the easy application, of course, to be made is that, well, you should